Welcome back, everybody, to the RippleEffect Podcast. I'm your co-host, Carla.
Hi, everyone. I'm Giana.
Hi, I'm Glenn.
Today, we have a special guest who also so happens to be our co-host. He is a Vietnam War veteran, former Summit County councilman, and 2022's congressional candidate for District 3 here in Utah. Before we move on to this topic, we'd like to let you all know that whether you're in Utah or any other state, we will be discussing districts very briefly during this podcast episode. And if you're curious about what district you live in, you can go ahead and head over to RippleEffectPodcast.com/blog to learn more and receive need-to-know links after each episode. Today, as we have mentioned, we have Glenn Wright here, and we are discussing the PACT Act, why it exists and why it's important. Carla?
Thanks, Giana. To start today's episode, let us define what the PACT Act is, what it means for our veterans, and why John Stewart fought so hard for our 9/11 first responders. Let's dive in. First, the full name of the PACT Act is the Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson Honoring Our Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxins Act, or for short, Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxins Act, or the PACT Act. That is what it stands for. So the PACT Act is a new law that expands VA healthcare and benefits for veterans exposed to burn pits, Agent Orange, and other toxic substances. So the PACT Act adds to the list of health conditions that we assume or presume are caused by exposure to these substances. So this law helps us provide generations of veterans and their survivors with the care and benefits that they've earned and honestly deserve at the very least for putting their lives on the line to protect or honor this country and the oath they took to the military. So if we're talking about toxins as it applies to veterans, it begs the question, toxins from what? So let's get into it. So to understand why the PACT Act exists, let's start off with its history. So why this PACT Act actually came to fruition and what it's meant to do. So I think in order to start there, we need to start with what exactly burn pits are and how they, what's the word I guess I'm looking for here? What they have to do with the military specifically, not just the Vietnam War, but the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. Burn pits were throughout all of them. So let's just start off there. So Dad, can you explain to us a little bit more, what are burn pits?
Burn pits are the way the military technique they use to get rid of essentially garbage and any type of waste materials they had. They didn't create landfills like we have in the United States. They piled everything up, sprayed it with jet fuel, and lit it up. And that's how the trash and various waste materials were disposed of in Iraq, Afghanistan, and to a lesser extent, but still prominently in Vietnam, even though we didn't really know about it, took much notice to it.
Gotcha. So the burn pits had to do with
burning and lots of other things, lots of other toxic materials, any type of carbon-based material that will burn, particularly synthetics, create lots of toxic gases when they're burned. And there was no safety procedures used for people surrounding them, and it caused a lot of long-term health problems that weren't realized until years after the exposure. And that's a common issue we had with several other types of exposures, both in Vietnam with Agent Orange and with the 9/11 cleanup.
Gotcha. Okay. So just continuing on with this, what hazards actually happened because of the burn pits?
The burn pits, most of the physical problems from burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, when we look at the diseases that are compensated through the Veterans Administration, are mostly cardiovascular type issues and mostly involving the lungs. And one of the most serious ones is what they call COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which in its extreme form could be fatal. But even in a minor form, causes you to have problem breathing. But there are lots of other related diseases, such things as asthma and allergies and things that obstruct your breathing process. The main issues associated with burn pits.
Gotcha. Okay. Giana, I think you had a question for him after this.
So we kind of dove right into a very specific topic that definitely impacts PACT Act. But Glenn, I just wanted to get clarification because I'm sure most of our listeners and burn pits are related to acts of war, right? Specifically.
Yeah. Yes, they're related to acts of war, but you can really get them in almost any environment if that's how you dispose of your waste material and your garbage. The PACT Act specifically addresses those health hazards associated with the people that were on duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, whether military or State Department or civilian contractors.
Or those associated with 9/11, like the cleanup that you mentioned. And I'm assuming in Vietnam, there were burn pits. How does that correlate to the PACT Act specifically?
Well, the PACT Act actually extended some of the diseases that were not originally covered by the original Agent Orange acts that were created to protect and provide compensation and health care for Vietnam veterans. So there were a few additional diseases that were associated. Most of the diseases in Vietnam were associated with Agent Orange, and they're similar. A lot of them are similar, but there are even more extensive diseases associated with Agent Orange that get in more into your other organs in your body, particularly the liver, and causing various types of cancers.
So let's rewind just a little bit. What is the PACT Act?
The PACT Act was passed just last year, and it provides a presumptive acknowledgement of these diseases, certain listed diseases, for anybody who was in Iraq and Afghanistan during the period that there were people that were assigned there. And the issue with presumptive diseases is that the VA pretty much has to compensate you and provide health care for those particular diseases. You don't have to prove it other than the fact that you were there. The VA cannot compensate for those diseases if they can prove that you actually got that disease from another cause. But that puts the burden on the VA to find another cause in your life. Whereas if it's not a presumptive disease, you have to actually prove to the VA that particular exposure caused your disease. So it makes it a lot easier for veterans to get compensation and health care under this particular act.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you know this, but my father is also a Vietnam veteran, and I was the beneficiary of many VA benefits that the United States has for dependents like myself. That was the only way I was able to go to college. Was I was a Chapter 35 dependent, and I had CHAMP VA healthcare as a supplemental way to have healthcare. So just to clarify, when it comes to the PACT Act, It is not the same thing as, let's say, a war veteran having some mental health issues post-war. This is specific to toxins and toxic substances related to burn pits, Agent Orange, and those sorts of related diseases. Is that fair to say?
That is correct. It doesn't affect such things as traumatic brain injury, PTSD, or physical injuries like amputations and other wounds. This is strictly diseases caused by exposure to the chemicals that came off the burn pits.
Well, so you mentioned presumptive disease. Could you expand on that? And, how does the VA define that? What does that look like to the VA and veterans?
Yeah, the whole concept of a presumptive disease is really important because, as I said earlier, a presumptive disease, if you have one of the listed diseases in the Act, whether it's the PACT Act or the legislation that created benefits for Agent Orange, or for that matter, I believe the World Trade Center Healthcare Act. Certain diseases of those type, if you were exposed to those in those circumstances, it is assumed that those were causes related to your actions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and the 9/11 cleanup. And it makes it a lot easier for people to claim disability and health care for those effects. Otherwise, you have to prove that. But for example, let's say you have a breathing disease. One of the more serious ones is, as I said, is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which really debilitates your lungs and can be fatal in the long term. Previously, if it wasn't a presumptive disease, you had to prove that particular disease was caused by your exposure to the burn pits or to Agent Orange or to the World Trade Center cleanup because of those activities, and not from something else. It was on the shoulders of the veteran or the 9/11 responder to make that case. And it took lawyers. It took many years. Now with presumptive assumption related to those diseases, the VA or the World Trade Center Healthcare Act, they have to prove that it didn't come from that. Your disease didn't come from that source. So they have to dig into your background and find out, what else was this person involved in? So bottom line is you're going to get compensated if you were exposed during any of those activities or for certain, with these certain diseases. One of the issues is, and why it took so long for these diseases to become compensated by the federal government, is that there are a lot of people in Congress who don't want to spend money. They're perfectly willing to send people off to war or to do hazardous cleanup activities, but then they don't want to pay for the health benefits that need to be appropriated afterwards. I had a discussion during a debate last year in the Congressional District 3 debate where my opponent voted against the PACT Act, and he said it was because he didn't want it to be what's called an entitlement. Well, first, I take great offense at calling something an entitlement that is associated with a veteran who served our country under hazardous circumstances. And the whole issue of entitlement with congressional appropriations, it means that they have to come up with the money every year for however many people are affected. Whereas if it's not an entitlement, then they have to specifically appropriate the money each year. And as I put it to Congressman Curtis last year, that means every year the veterans have to come beg Congress for more money if the existing funds aren't sufficient. And I think that's just a despicable way to handle and the situation and to take care of our veterans.
I.e. John Stewart, ring a bell to anyone? Right? Didn't he have some impact with 9/11?
He was had a major impact in getting that type of compensation for the 9/11 cleanup. Anybody who was associated with the 9/11 exposures, mostly the people who were involved in the cleanup.
As I sit here today, I can't help but think what an incredible metaphor this room is for the entire process that getting health care and benefits for 9/11 first responders has come to. Behind me, a filled room of 9/11 first responders, and in front of me, a nearly empty Congress.
And we knew right from day one that there were going to be health exposures associated with the destruction of the World Trade Center towers. In my professional life, I actually did an inspection in one of the World Trade Center towers, and I believe it was late 92 or early 93. And those buildings were built before asbestos was banned as a construction material. And asbestos was a very good fire protection material for protecting steel from fires. And it wasn't banned in the U.S. until the mid-70s. So these buildings were built in the 60s and early 70s. And as soon as I saw those buildings come down, I saw the clouds that occurred there. I'm sure everybody has seen the dust clouds rolling down the streets in lower Manhattan when the buildings collapsed. Those dust clouds were filled with asbestos and other toxic materials caused by the collapse of the building and volatilizing synthetic materials that were also used in construction of the building. Anybody who had studied industrial hygiene or industrial toxicology would have known that there were major exposures there. When you remove asbestos from a building, you've seen pictures of people in these bunny suits with supplied air apparatus. And you noticed in the cleanup, none of that was done because it was such a large cleanup operation. You would have had to put a tent and evacuate all of lower Manhattan to sufficiently detoxify the environment there. It just wasn't practical. But we knew it. Anybody who had studied industrial toxicology knew that was going to happen. And it took 20 years after 9/11 for the people who worked there to be compensated. Recently, I just heard that the number of firefighters who have died from the after effects, the toxic after effects of 9/11, has just reached parity with the number of first responders killed on 9/11.
Yeah. I mean, Carla and I saw that article, right? The fire department in New York City first responder death count is now equivalent to when the first 9/11 attacks happened. How do you see that impacting PACT Act overall and just the veterans that are part of that?
Well, I think the Agent Orange exposures for Vietnam veterans, the PACT Act for Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Vietnam veterans, and the toxic exposures associated with the 9/11 cleanup all have this in common. We knew, or we found out fairly shortly after these issues came to the light, that there were potential health hazards. But it took decades in each case for enough congressmen to vote to compensate and provide health care for veterans and for 9/11 responders for the health effects from these issues. They're not all the same, but they are, the political issues involved and the policy issues involved from our national government are have a common thread.
Okay. I'm going to jump in here real quick. So let's take a step back because there's a couple things I'd like to circle back to. So the first is stepping back to what you were saying about, anybody who has studied industrial engineering. I think it's important to point out that you do have a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering, but you spent the rest of your professional life in safety engineering. Is that the way
that is correct. I spent 30 years as working in the field of industrial safety and fire protection for an insurance company. And early on in my career, I took some college level courses, both in industrial hygiene and industrial toxicology.
So it's fair to say that you have visited tons of sites that have to do with these issues, not just commercial buildings, but mines, factories.
Yes, I have visited hundreds of factories like that, and I've actually done industrial hygiene testing in many of those factories where the company I worked for might have had or was proposed to have the workers' compensation insurance. So I'm very familiar with the processes involved and the safety procedures that have to be followed if you have those types of airborne exposures.
Yeah, that's right. So knowing that information, let's take it one more step back. So going back to the burn pits now from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and kind of how this all ties into 9/11. You served as a Vietnam War veteran. You were a forward air controller. So for people who don't know what that is, that's a guy that gets into an OV-2 or an OV-10 and he flies around and gets shot at. And it sounds way less dramatized because I would not want to do that. Drones do that today. But
yes, we did back in the Vietnam era what the drones do today, but we didn't in light aircraft right over the battlefield.
Correct. So let's start off there. So how many missions did you serve?
I flew approximately 250 combat missions in 71 in Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, and in 73 at the very end of hostilities in Cambodia.
Okay. So I think you said you served over 250 missions in total, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So out of that 250 missions, how many times were you burning?
That was, fortunately for me, a very small exposure for 6 weeks in February and March of 1971. I was flying close air support missions in support of the South Vietnamese Army and Marines in their invasion of Laos. And they brought about 30 or 40 of us forward air controllers and put us in this really big tent with double deck bunks and a 5-holer outhouse outside, which was known as the officer's 5-holer. And every evening, the junior officers in this group got to consolidate the refuse from 5 of the 5-holers into one big 55-gallon drum, pour jet fuel in, a little aviation gas on top of it, and light it off and burn it up every night.
What the hell is going on in here?
So that was an exposure we all had. We all took turns doing that. But I think the interesting issue was this was right next to our tent. So even if you weren't conducting the burn yourself that night, everybody in the tent was exposed to the toxic byproducts.
Not to mention those that are impacted by the war in whatever country you're in, right?
Yes.
Which I don't.
Yeah, I think if we go back to Iraq and Afghanistan, anybody who lived near U.S. military facilities would have had similar exposures.
Yeah, that's sad to think about.
And in Vietnam, Agent Orange was used pretty much everywhere. And as a pilot, you would think we weren't.
For us, really quickly, I don't think we've defined it yet.
What's that?
Agent Orange. Can you define what that is for?
Oh, sure. Agent Orange was a herbicide that we used to defoliate the jungle so we could see better and see where the enemy was. And it was used extensively throughout Vietnam and Laos. And as a pilot, we weren't exposed to it as potentially ground troops who were very close to it. But it turns out a guy that I went through tactical training with and served my entire first tour in Vietnam without flying out of Pleiku. I looked him up several years later. We started having reunions back around 2000, and I was wondering why he hadn't shown up. And the internet wasn't that robust back then, but only a few years ago now, about 4 or 5 years ago, I looked him up on the internet. I found his obituary, and he died in the mid-90s. I think it was something like 93, 94, sometime in that time frame, of what's now considered an Agent Orange disease. And it was right after Agent Orange was actually acknowledged as a problem for Vietnam veterans. As I said earlier, it took 20 years for that to occur after the end of the war.
Gotcha. I have one it's kind of a curveball question. What did it smell? What did the burn pit smell like?
My experience with it was mostly smelling like burned aviation fuel. You got the odor of the refuse in the officer's 5-holer as you were emptying the 5 drums into one, and watching the refuse and toilet paper and various things like that go into one 55-gallon drum. Once you lit it off, it smelled like burning jet fuel, something I was very familiar with.
So it didn't smell like burning and jet fuel. It's just overwhelmingly jet fuel.
The smell was really overwhelmingly jet fuel.
Gross.
It was the time before that when you were emptying five cans into one that you got the other odors.
Gotcha.
I mean, do you want jet fuel or do you want 9/11 like dust, right? What was that material? I mean, it's building, it's all kinds of materials, but it's such a thick layer. I mean, I will never forget those pictures. I mean, I remember watching 9/11 happen on the news.
I think we probably all did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just kind of amazing how the impacts of war, how they impact.
Yeah. And that was war. That was really our first effort in the war on terror.
So just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today and for answering these questions about the PACT Act. If anyone listening has further questions about how to receive benefits from the PACT Act, you can contact the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, or TAPS, and you can call them at 800-959-8277, though I doubt you guys will. So you can just hop over to the website, www.taps.org, if you wanted to check out some more information on that. So as we wrap up today for our visual learners, don't forget to head over to our YouTube channel at RippleEffect Podcast for an enhanced version of today's podcast. We'll insert some more tidbits and just kind of facts and historical stuff to go along with what we discussed today. If you have a political question that you would like answered on this podcast, feel free to head over to our website, www.RippleEffectPodcast.com, to make it a submission. We are definitely looking out for those submissions so that we can answer any political questions that you guys may have. Don't forget to follow our socials. We're on TikTok and YouTube, both at Ripple Effect Podcast, and we're on Instagram at official Ripple Effect Podcast. Those are our handles. So if you like our content and want to see more, be sure to like our videos and subscribe to our channels. Tell us what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to our email list to receive news about upcoming episodes and nutshell blogs recapping these long episodes that we're going into that are a little bit more digestible. So think Cliff Notes, but in a blog format. So thanks everybody for joining. We really appreciate your continued support of this podcast, and we will see you guys later.